Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Let's Make a Better World. I'm your host, David Tare, and I decided to do a series of videos on space travel since my video, I have one video already on this channel on why I think it's important for America, probably for the whole world, to make it a priority to venture into outer space. Like they say on Star Trek, space is the final frontier. And, people were very excited about going into space during the space race in the 50s and 60s, but we haven't done too much, I don't think, in space since the 70s. We've lost a lot of interest, which I think is really, really unfortunate. And that's what I talk about in my first video, and I already have about 1,300 views on that video. So I figured, maybe since it's so popular, I'd do a whole series on space travel because I know a lot about it. I mean, I've studied physics for about half my life. I know the physics of involved in space travel. I also know a lot about outer space. I know a lot about astronomy and cosmology and all that stuff. So anyway, today I'm just going to talk about how we can get into outer space. You might be wondering that yourself. How do we do it? And before I actually talk about the science involved in how to go to outer space, I just want to talk about a little bit of history about the sci-fi and space travel. So you might also wonder, when were people first interested in going into outer space or even entertain the idea of going into outer space? Well, the first example that I know of was there was a novel by this was from 1620. This was by Bishop Francis Godwin. And the title of this was The Man in the Moon, spelled Moone. I guess that's Old English spelling. And he calls it a voyage of utopian discovery. So he was very interested in going into space, going to the moon in particular. A few years later, there was Johannes Kepler. He's very famous. You probably heard of him. He was a very famous astronomer from a Danish astronomer, and he did some very important science. He modeled the solar system very well. He came up with his three laws of planetary motion, which are correct. Newton proved that about a century later. But he also wrote a sci-fi book called the English translation is Somnium, and I guess it was supposed to be a fantasy voyage. This guy was asleep. He dreams of going to the moon, I guess, and there was interest in going to space, going to the moon as early as the 17th century. And probably the most famous sci fi writer I know of who talked about going to the moon was Jules Verne. He wrote two books about it. His first one was called From the Earth to the Moon, and then he came up with a sequel called Around the Moon. I read both of these. When I was in high school, I read both of these. They're excellent books. Jules Verne is one of my favorite sci fi authors of all time, and he lived in the 19th century. He was a French sci fi author from the 19th century. He wrote several really excellent sci fi novels. These are just a couple of them. But these are the ones where he talks about, imagines taking a trip to the moon again. I guess people were interested in going to the moon. They didn't know what else was out in outer space, really. I mean, the moon's the closest heavenly body to the Earth, so I guess it makes sense that the early sci-fi writers were interested in going to the moon. And there was a very famous movie, the first movie ever made about going to the moon. This was back in 1902. This was very shortly after the first movies were ever made. This was a movie called. It was a French film by the French filmmaker Georges Métras. Metra, I guess you don't pronounce the final S. But it was called Le Voyage dans la Lune, which means a trip to the moon in French. And this came out, like I said, 1902. I've actually seen this movie. It's pretty amazing. I mean, that they were able to make this in 1902, I think is pretty amazing. Of course, it looks very primitive today. I'm not saying it's an impressive sci fi movie to watch today, but just the fact that they were making a movie about a trip in outer space, in particular the moon, back in 1902, I think it's pretty amazing. And so that's all I'm going to say about some of the early sci-fi of space travel. Obviously, there was a lot of interest in it for a very, very long time. But we finally did go to space, and you might wonder how we did it. I mean, the first, I think the space race started in 1957 with Sputnik. Maybe I'll just show, I don't have a picture of Sputnik. But, the space race started with the first launch by the Soviet Union of Sputnik in 1957. There were even efforts to try to get into space before that. I mean, rocketry. I guess Goddard made the first liquid fuel rocket in 1926, and people had been, engineers had been making more and more powerful rockets for some time during the 30s and 40s and 50s, and I think even the United States was trying to go to outer space, but the way we were trying to do it was very different from the way we actually ended up doing it. But anyway, let me just talk about how you can get into space. So I think it was Isaac Newton who actually figured this out. Let's just think about projectile motion. So you probably know if you throw a ball, if you give it some horizontal velocity, it's going to move in a parabola. It lands on the ground, but it moves as it's going. And since the Earth is round, you can imagine don't no longer imagine a ball. You have to imagine something much faster than that, say a cannon. So imagine you had a cannon that was, way, way up in the air. I mean, I guess you'd want it away from the Earth's atmosphere, ideally. But, I mean, let's just neglect wind resistance. It makes life a lot easier if you do that. So imagine you have this big, what do you call it, thing to prop up a cannon on. I don't even know what that's called, but you launch the cannons horizontally, and you can vary the speed at which you launch the cannons. And if you do it kind of slow, you end up not too far from where you launched it. That's A. So that kind of makes sense. That's just like a cannon moving in a parabolic arc, like a ball would move if you threw it. But if you give it a little bit more velocity, obviously it's going to go farther. But you'll notice that the Earth is curving away from the cannonball. So if you launch it fast enough, if you go to C, then it will never hit the ground because it's still curving, it's still falling. See, this is kind of a weird thing. I mean, you can fall in a circle. You can fall without ever hitting the ground. That seems kind of paradoxical, but actually Isaac Newton discovered this when the apple fell in his orchard, he realized he had a brilliant insight. It was back in 1665. He had a brilliant insight that it was the same force that caused an apple to fall off a tree as what kept the moon in orbit. And it is force, it's centrifugal force of the Earth pulling on, or centripetal, I should say. The Earth's gravity creates a centripetal force, and that's a force centered towards the center of the Earth that keeps the cannonball in this case moving in a circular orbit. So it is falling, even though it's falling horizontally. That's why when you're in a space capsule orbiting the Earth, you're weightless. Because if you're on a falling object, you're always weightless. I mean, suppose you were in an elevator and the elevator cable snapped. You wouldn't want that to happen, obviously. But if it did happen, if there was no wind resistance, if it was falling at, little g, which is 9.8 meters per second squared, you'd be falling along with the elevator and you'd be weightless. You would be weightless inside the elevator, just like you would be weightless if you're orbiting the Earth, because you're falling. You're falling along with the capsule. People don't really realize that. Some people say, that you've escaped the Earth's gravity. That's not true at all. You're still falling with the Earth. But you do it a little faster, and you no longer have a circular orbit. Now you have an elliptical orbit. And now, you're starting at what's called the apogee. That's the close, I forget which is which. I think the apogee is the point that's closest to the center of the Earth. So that's the fulcrum of the cannon. But then if you launch it a little faster than the orbital speed, by the way, is very fast. It's about 5 miles per second, or about 17,000 miles an hour. That's how fast you would have had to launch the cannon in order for it to orbit the Earth. That's why this is so hard to do, because you have to have a very, very powerful rocket. I mean, we don't use cannons, we use rockets. And the interesting thing about cannon, actually, I should say, in the book I talked about, this book, the first one, From the Earth to the Moon, I guess around the moon too. the way that Jules Verne imagined that the astronauts were going to be launched into outer space, this wouldn't have worked at all. He didn't think of using a rocket. He thought of using a cannon. He thought we could explode the astronauts in a capsule from a cannon. The problem with that, yeah, if the cannon was powerful enough, it would be able to escape the Earth's gravity and go into orbit. The problem is, it would be an instantaneous acceleration of thousands of G's, and that would kill the crew immediately. So you couldn't do it, because it would be too many G's. They'd be flattened like a pancake. So that was one thing that Jules Verne got wrong. You have to use rockets, and you have to do it kind of gradually. But if you get up to the trick is to get up to 5 miles per second, or 17,000 miles an hour, so you can orbit the Earth. And if you went a little faster, I think D is more like 20,000 miles an hour, maybe 6 miles per second. Then you'll go into an elliptical orbit where the perigee is farther away. But if you do it even faster, you have to go up to what's called the escape velocity, which is about 7 miles per second, or about 25,000 miles per hour. If you do that, that's actually what was done when we went to the moon. We had to escape from the Earth's gravity to go to the moon in the Apollo missions. So we had to have a rocket powerful enough, Saturn V it turned out, to go 7 miles per second. That's the only way we could escape the Earth. And if you go that fast, then you're not going to be pulled back. You can go into outer space. You can get away from the Earth. I mean, you're still in outer space if you're orbiting Earth, but you can go even farther if you go fast enough. So that's the idea. And I'm just going to show a few pictures of some early rockets. This is the Redstone. This was the first rocket that sent Americans into outer space. This is what we use for the Mercury missions. It had to be powerful enough to get the Mercury capsules up there. The Mercury capsules were pretty small, though, and we were just orbiting the Earth, so they didn't have to be a huge rocket. It was still pretty big, though. But yeah, I think I had a picture. Maybe these aren't in order. Yeah, here's the Saturn V. This is the one that took us to the moon. This is the big. I think this is still the biggest rocket that's ever been built. Huge, huge rocket. I mean, this thing was 360 feet tall as a skyscraper, as tall as like a 30-story building. So it was a very, very large rocket. And why do these things have to be so large? Well, the reason that the rockets have to be so large just to send up a little capsule in outer space is because they have to carry the weight of all the fuel. It's kind of an exponential growth because the reason that you can get the way to get to the either the orbital velocity or the escape velocity in the case of Saturn V, you have to accelerate and you have to overcome the Earth's gravity. So you have to have a very, very powerful rocket to do that, first of all. But then don't forget that the rocket's not just launching this capsule, which is the only thing you really want to get in outer space. It also has to launch the weight of all the fuel. So, you have to have a lot of fuel just to launch the rest of the fuel. And you can work this out. And it turns out that I think for most of the rocket launches we've had into outer space, the weight of the rocket had to be, I think, at least 60 times the weight of the capsule. So we had to carry a lot of additional weight. Um, you know, yeah, let me turn that off. So, that's why it's so hard to go to outer space. And here's just a picture of the space shuttle. I like showing this picture. The advantage of the space shuttle, I mean, this one only went into orbit. It didn't escape. But, and it wasn't as nearly as big a rocket that launched it as the Saturn V. But it was pretty big. But the nice thing about the space shuttle, I'm sure you know, was reusable. It was the first reusable capsule that sent people into space. As a matter of fact, well, there were like four. I think there were 4 or 5 space shuttles. A couple of them failed and blew up. Unfortunately, killed the crew along with them. But the ones that succeeded, they were reused many, many times. I mean, I think it was a total of 135 space missions. So on the space shuttle. So it was reused a lot, and that's a good thing. But I think what would be even better is if we could launch rockets not from Earth. See, the reason why we have to have such big rockets It's all just because we have to escape from the Earth. We didn't even need that big a rocket to get away from the moon. I mean, you guys probably know that when we went to the moon, we the way we landed on the moon was with this thing called the lunar module. That thing wasn't all that big, it wasn't much bigger. It was part of the whole package that went to the moon. It was the thing we used to land on the moon, but it also had to take off from the surface. So, since the moon is so much smaller than the Earth, has so much less gravity, it wasn't that hard to launch ourselves off the moon because the moon's a lot lighter, a lot smaller. And the ideal thing would be if we had, like, we already have the International Space Station, ISS. It's a space platform, a permanent space platform orbiting the Earth, and there's no gravity. I mean, we're weightless on the space station. Is the correct way to say it. So if we launch something from the space station, we can launch it right away. We don't have to be overcoming any gravity to do that. As a matter of fact, every time you have to get back from the space station, you have to, hop back in your space vehicle that got you there and you have to launch it off. So we're doing this anyway. But, that's how I think in the future we should be going into space. We shouldn't be leaving the Earth every time. We should first have a big enough space platform. Even the moon wouldn't be bad either. Since, like I said, the moon has much less gravity than the Earth. If we had a big launch pad, or maybe several launch pads on the moon, a permanent settlement on the moon, we could be sending other voyages from the moon. And I don't think we should be sending, space voyages from Earth. I mean, of course, if they're people on Earth, you have to get them off the Earth first. So at some point, you have to get them off the Earth. But once they're already off the Earth, unless they want to go back, they can go wherever else they want in space. So anyway, I just thought, this would be an interesting video. So now you know how to get to space, you know what's involved. And I hope this was enlightening for you guys. I'm going to do several other videos on space travel because it seems to be a very popular topic. And I really like it myself. I'm very hopeful about a future in outer space. I don't know if I'm going to get to live to see it. I do want to. I hope this isn't just a pipe dream, but one of my dreams before I die. I don't know how much longer I can be around. I'm 62 right now. I'm hoping to make it to 90, but I do want to go into outer space. I want to orbit the Earth at least once. If I can orbit the Earth once, which takes about 90 minutes, then I'll be happy. I'll feel like I lived my dream of going into space. But anyway, that concludes my video for today. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.